Let's look at the light reaction or the light-dependent reaction. Recall that the light reaction happens in the thylakoid. So if we were to picture the little disc shapes that make up a granum, okay, we have a stack of them. Each little disc, this membrane, this picture here represents the membrane on those discs. So you have the inner thylakoid space, which would be inside the disc, and the stroma, which is the liquid outside the disc, and then the thylakoid membrane. And notice that it is still a phospholipid bilayer. All right, even though they're small, they still have this kind of structure on the membrane. So you have this surrounding the whole disc. And we're going to talk about each part of this process in order for the energy to be absorbed by sunlight and photosynthesis to occur so that the autotrophs can make glucose. Let's start with electrons. Okay, here we have a ground state electron. It's stable. It doesn't have a lot of energy. It's not doing much. Well, if we take that electron and we add sunlight energy to it, what happens is it's actually going to become high energy and it becomes excited. So it starts to bounce. All right, so now we have, picture this little electron bouncing down along a path because it's excited, it has energy. Now let's look at the different parts of that membrane. If we talk about photosystems, we're talking about a group of chlorophyll molecules. Now remember, chlorophyll is a green pigment that's going to absorb sunlight energy. So let's just talk about this right now. Okay, so what happens, the first thing is that we have sunlight that's going to be absorbed by the chlorophyll, and then that energy is transferred to those ground state electrons that are waiting. When that happens, water is going to be split into hydrogen ions and oxygen. Okay, so oxygen's at this point going to be given off as waste, okay, and the hydrogen ions are going to continue through this reaction. Then what happens is these electrons are going to bounce down what's called an electron transport chain, and they're actually going to move to photosystem 1. So they go from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. As they move, they're actually going to transport these hydrogen ions from the stroma into the thylakoid by active transport. So if we notice here that we have the electrons moving along the chain, and we've got lots of hydrogen ions up here, so we need them up there, but we have a hydrogen ion down here. So it has to be pumped back across that membrane. Okay, this would be our transport protein here for active transport. So it needs to use a little bit of ATP in order to do that. So energy is going to be used, active transport happens, and hydrogen ions are pumped back into the thylakoid. Now we have the electrons end up at photosystem 1. Okay, we have more energy being absorbed by the chlorophyll, so that energy gets transferred to those electrons, and those electrons are picked up by NADP+. Okay, this is another energy compound to form NADPH. Okay, so this would be our stored form of energy. This is our not stored form. It's ready. It's a carrier. And what happens is we have, if we look at this little diagram, NADP plus is kind of like a little taxi. It's an electron acceptor. It's going to accept an electron, and then this NADP plus is actually going to turn into NADPH. So it shuttles it, and then it gets used. This electron will be given off, and it's going to be used, and then it will be recycled. And again, it's NADP plus, picks up an electron, NADPH. This is the electron carrier or acceptor. So you have this electron acceptor, and then it shuttles it, it carries electron. This is the carrier. Now, at photosystem 2, we talked about light being absorbed, and then we have high energy electrons moving down the electron transport chain, and water is split into hydrogen ions and oxygen. At the electron transport chain, all right, we have electrons moving from photosystem 2 to 1. Remember, it goes 2 to 1. Energy from the electrons is going to be used to transport that hydrogen from the stroma into the thylakoid by active transport. Now at photosystem 1, light again is absorbed by chlorophyll. The energy is transferred to the electrons, and then we have the electrons picking up are being picked up by NADP plus to form the NADPH. From there, now we have a concentration gradient. So because these hydrogen ions are being pumped back into the thylakoid, we've got lots of hydrogens inside the thylakoid and not a lot of them outside. So remember that causes concentration gradient. And what's going to want to happen, the hydrogen ions are going to want to go to where there's a lower concentration, towards the stroma. So active transport is going to pump these hydrogens back into the thylakoid. And then, because we have more here, inside the thylakoid, they're going to move through a process called chemiosmosis. Now, you should recognize osmosis being the movement of water across a membrane, while chemiosmosis is a form of transport, it's passive, where the hydrogen ions are going to move through ATP synthase, remember synthase being an enzyme. So they're going to move through this ATP synthase because of that concentration gradient. They're going to move from a high concentration to a low concentration. When that happens, that causes ATP synthase to turn. So it's turning like a crank. And as it does that, it's actually adding a phosphate onto ADP. Remember, ADP is the uncharged battery. And then ATP when it has the 3-phosphate. So when this turns, we're adding that phosphate onto the ADP to form a fully charged battery. So we have this stored form of energy. And that's how we're going to form ATP. And then that ATP is going to be used for the Calvin cycle or the light independent reactions.